Throughout the entire history of humanity, time after time, we convince ourselves that the wealth we create is actually real, that our system is stable, that currencies are reliable, that financial institutions provide proper protection, and that our economy is fully under control. And every single time, we are wrong. All the biggest crises, crashes, financial collapses in history were never an accident. Every era had its own reasons: wars, epidemics, government failures, excessive debt. But the result was always the same: a loss of trust in money. Because money is not value. Money is simply a collective belief that can disappear in an instant. And in today's video, we will go step by step through 5 historical events from ancient Byzantium to modern times to see what actually survives when money stops being worth anything. And we will look at the patterns that each era left behind for us and why they might be extremely important right now. Let's start from the very early times Byzantium, around the 10th century, when on the ruins of Rome one of the most stable economies in history emerged. The foundation of that economy was a gold coin called the solidus, introduced by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in the early 4th century. And for the next 7 centuries, this coin remained the ultimate symbol of reliability because it was almost pure gold and instantly became the trusted standard among nations. This coin was accepted everywhere: in Europe, the Middle East, Asia. It basically served as the global reserve currency of the medieval world, just like the US dollar today. But as always happens, even the most stable system could not resist the temptation of easy money. And by the 11th century, the empire began losing financial stability due to military expenses, budget deficits, and the need to cover massive costs. So Byzantium did what every modern state eventually repeats: it began debasing its currency. Over just a few decades, the gold content of the coin dropped from about 95% to 70%, and later it fell even further. It may seem minor, but this small decision very quickly destroyed trust in the currency. The coins became lighter, duller. Merchants began demanding more coins for the same goods, and foreign partners refused to accept them entirely. The trust on which the empire stood simply vanished. This triggered a financial crisis that today we would call an inflationary spiral. In 1092, Alexios I Komnenos introduced a reform and replaced the debased solidus with a new coin, the hyperpyron, which contained much less gold. This essentially marked the end of the true gold standard. For Byzantium, it was not just a currency weakening, it was a loss of reputation, influence, and credibility in the eyes of its trading partners and its own citizens. And as the money collapsed, so did the empire's economic power. However, some people survived this crisis: those who held real gold, land, or goods outside state control. And here comes the first key pattern. Any government, sooner or later, cannot resist the temptation to debase its own currency. And when that moment comes, value always returns to real assets. After the fall of Byzantium, Europe entered a new era of growth. Trade expanded, cities grew, craftsmanship developed. It finally looked like, after centuries of instability, the continent had found a path to sustained development. But what happened in 1347 completely changed the meaning of human labor and wealth. The plague, later called the Black Death, arrived. It became the most devastating pandemic in European history. In just 4 years, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died. For the economy, it was a catastrophe with not only destructive consequences, but paradoxical ones. Because when the workforce is cut in half, labor becomes the scarcest resource, changing the entire structure of the system. People who previously were at the bottom of society, peasants, craftsmen, laborers, suddenly gained bargaining power and could set their own terms. By around 1350, Wages in England and France doubled or even tripled in some sectors. Land, on the contrary, became cheaper because there were not enough people to work it. Fields were abandoned, homes, workshops, even entire estates were being sold for a fraction of their previous value. Those who had silver, grain, or other liquid assets were able to capitalize on the situation, buying land and property at extremely low prices. For those who survived and had capital, the crisis was not a disaster, it was an opportunity. Governments tried to stop wage growth and force workers to stay put. In England, for example, laws were introduced prohibiting paying more than before the plague and requiring workers to accept any job at old wage levels. But that didn't work because the labor market had changed forever. And just a few decades later, Europe's entire economy was reorganized. Agriculture became less profitable, and along with that, the role of cities and trade grew. A new social class began to form, people who earn not from land, but from labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And from this comes the second pattern. Any crisis is a redistribution of wealth. It always punishes those who wait for help from the system and rewards those who prepare their own financial protection in advance. After the plague reshaped Europe's entire social and economic landscape, the continent entered a new era, the era of money, of credit and trade. By the mid-15th century, Florence had become the financial center of Europe. This is where the biggest banks of their time were located, the Bardi and Peruzzi families. They served whole cities, the church, and monarchs. They had branches from London to Constantinople and controlled a large share of European trade. They became what today we would call too big to fail. Their main clients were monarchs, and the largest among them was the King of England, Edward II, who needed enormous sums for the war with France. The banks financed him for years, giving him huge loans based on promises of future repayment. But when the war dragged on, it became clear that these promises were nothing more than empty words. The king stopped paying his debts, destroying not only his own reputation, but the entire credit system built on trust. By the mid-1340s, the Bardi and Peruzzi banks collapsed. It wasn't only the king's fault. Speculation and excessive risk-taking also played a major role. For Florence, this became a true financial catastrophe. The default of the largest banks triggered a chain reaction of bankruptcies that paralyzed trade, broke supply chains, and shook trust in financial institutions. It devastated the region's entire economy. People who once viewed the Bardi and Peruzzi families as symbols of wealth and stability suddenly realized that even the largest institutions could collapse the moment trust disappears. Banks that had been considered reliable for centuries vanished within months, along with the savings, deposits, and capital of thousands of people who trusted them. The only ones who weren't affected were those who held real assets, gold, cash reserves, land, goods, anything with true value that did not rely on someone else's promises. And this situation showed a simple rule. If all your wealth is someone else's obligation, then it exists only as long as that trust lasts. And from this comes the third pattern. Financial institutions are not eternal. Even the largest and most reliable ones can collapse if trust disappears. Now let's jump 6 centuries forward to the late 1990s to see how empires changed, how the global economy transformed, how new markets, currencies, and technologies emerged, yet financial laws remained exactly the same. Southeast Asia. By the late 90s, it was seen as the model of an economic miracle. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, these countries had been showing rapid growth for decades. They built, exported, attracted investment. But the main problem was that most of this growth was built on external debt, specifically US dollar debt. Thailand became the first to face the consequences of this dollar dependence. Its currency, the Thai baht, had been pegged to the dollar for years, and the economy kept borrowing in dollars because rates were lower and risks seemed minimal. But as soon as the exchange rate began to shake, stability collapsed instantly. In the summer of 1997, speculation crushed the local currency. The central bank tried to defend the peg by burning through foreign reserves, but by July, it was forced to abandon the dollar peg. The baht collapsed by more than half. The real crisis came from the fact that Thailand's external debt had exceeded $100 billion, and now it was impossible to repay because the loans were in dollars, while income was earned in a devalued currency. The problem spread across the entire region. Investors began withdrawing capital from neighboring countries. Currencies in Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea began to crash. The Indonesian rupiah fell by more than 80%. Stock markets collapsed, hundreds of national banks went bankrupt, and GDP in several countries dropped by 7 to 10%. Millions lost their jobs. And in just a few months, Southeast Asia, once the world's symbol of rapid growth, fell into a deep crisis. And this story reminded the world of a simple truth, one that applies not just to countries, but to everyday people. When you live on borrowed money, you become dependent. As long as everything is stable, debt feels convenient. It accelerates growth, makes life easier, allows you to buy more. But even the smallest instability instantly turns debt into a tool of losing control. When you live on borrowed money, you're no longer in control. The circumstances control you. And from this comes the fourth pattern. Debt is dependence. In any form, on any level. The world barely recovered from past crises when in 2019 history again showed how fragile trust in money can be. This time, we moved to Lebanon, a country whose banking system in the 2010s was considered a model of quality and reliability. A fixed exchange rate of the national currency to the US dollar, tens of billions in deposits, and high interest rates, all of this created the illusion of stability. But in reality, Lebanon had been living off external dollars for decades, artificially supporting the exchange rate of its local currency, which didn't reflect economic reality. And the banking system turned into a kind of financial pyramid that depended on a constant inflow of new deposits. When that flow of dollars stopped, the system became unstable and the entire structure collapsed. In 2019, a financial crisis began. Against the backdrop of rising government debt and mass protests, banks suddenly started freezing deposits. People could not get their money back. At first, banks promised it was a temporary measure to stabilize the situation, but soon citizens realized no one was planning to return their money. In the following years, the Lebanese pound collapsed by more than 90%, and inflation reached triple-digit levels. The economy shrank by almost 20%. Around $93 billion in deposits were stuck in banks with no possibility of withdrawal. People stood in lines outside branches, begging to withdraw at least part of their savings. Later, withdrawal limits were introduced, $200 to $300 per week. People who had saved for decades lost everything in an instant. Only those who kept some of their assets outside the banking system, in cash savings, gold, real estate, managed to preserve their wealth. For everyone else, the money in the bank turned out to be nothing more than a promise no one intended to keep. And this leads us to the fifth pattern. Money in the bank is not your money. It's just a promise that only works as long as everything is calm. Throughout the entire history of civilization, forms of government changed, money changed, technologies changed, and even the very idea of wealth changed. But one thing always stayed the same: value exists only when trust exists. Byzantium, Florence, Asia, Lebanon, all these stories remind us that the ones who survive are not those who trust promises, but those who hold real value in their hands and know how to use it. History never repeats itself literally, but the patterns are always the same. And those who see these patterns are the ones able to use any changes to benefit their lives. Share your thoughts in the comments. How do you see what's happening, and what conclusions have you made for yourself after watching this video? And if today's information was useful, I kindly ask you, friends, to support this video with a like, because your support helps our channel grow and allows us to create more meaningful and valuable content. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we have many new and exciting topics ahead. Thank you to each of you for watching. I wish you a great mood. I wish you a wonderful day, and see you in the next video. Bye everyone.